Welcome to the Register's Report. My name is John Buckley. I'm the Register of Deeds of Plymouth County. This show is about Plymouth County real estate. And we'll talk about the numbers for recordings and all of that for the month of June. Our headline for the month in our newsletter was June closes the first half of 2015 with a bang, because we had a lot of activity at the Registry of Deeds. There was a tremendous difficult winter, as we all know, and a lot of real estate came to a halt during the months of January, February, and March, and even extending into April. You're going to see an image come up on the screen for deeds. Deeds is a sale of property, a document we get in the registry and record relative to the transfer of ownership interests. There were 1,037 deeds recorded in June, compared to 799 in May. There were 6% more recorded than in June of 2014. However, year to date, we're still down 1% over last year, and we're catching up with that. The next document you're going to see is a bar chart of mortgages. We had a drop in mortgage filings last year. When rates went up, a lot of people stopped refinancing. However, in the first 6 months of 2015, we've seen some great improvements. There were 2,139 mortgages recorded in June of this year, more than the 1,869 in May, and up 29% compared to the 1,662 mortgages recorded last June. So for the first 6 months of 2015, our mortgage recordings are up 38% over last year. And clearly, mortgages are used for the purchase of property, but a lot of people that own property that have a mortgage could take advantage of low interest rates. We're at a tremendously low interest rate period right now, which isn't going to last forever, and people have taken advantage of that. We also report foreclosure issues. A foreclosure deed is when a property has been taken back by a lender from an individual. There were 54 foreclosure deeds recorded in June, more than the 41 recorded in May of this year, 145% higher than last June. A lot of lenders are clearing out back files that have been not accessed and are moving forward to try to clear up back inventory. There's a foreclosure notice that comes into the registry, which is a document that shows when somebody is beginning to get into trouble. There were 84 foreclosure notices recorded in June, down from the 119 in May, but up 2% from last June. Those are up 20% over the first 6 months of 2014. You'll also see a document now come up, foreclosures and orders of notice by community. Obviously, every community has a different experience. The city of Brockton, the town of Plymouth, and Wareham have had the most difficulty during this time period. And there are organizations that will help people try to modify their loans rather than get into foreclosure. NeighborWorks of Southern Mass being one. A couple quick stories about the registry. Our training room for online training will open again on Thursday, September 3rd at 9 o'clock. It's a great opportunity to learn how to use our internet site to search our land records. We held Middleborough office hours in May, Council on Aging meetings in Hingham and Rochester. We're coming up with those in Hingham and Rochester in August. We're going to be continuing with those Council on Aging outreach to make sure people understand the Homestead Act and all the various opportunities there are to protect their land records. We're still feeling the effect of the 30% staff layoff that we held at the registry. People have been very patient in allowing us to deal with that. We had a very extreme filing boom at the end of June, and we worked well to get everybody on record. My guest in the next show is Susan Aprill. She's the archivist of the Kingston Public Library. Normally, we bring on a special guest relative to recording or title examination, but being the month of July, we thought we'd do something a little lighter in nature, and there'll be 12 different locations in the town of Kingston that'll come up as images on your screen, and Susan and I will have our conversation about that. So we're moving on to the next segment. Susan Aprill, the archivist of the Kingston Public Library.
It's a short ride from your neighborhood to your naturehood. To find a neighborhood park or green space near you, visit discovertheforest.org.
Welcome back to the Register's Report. My name is John Buckley. I'm the Register of Deeds of Plymouth County. In this segment of the show, we usually do something relative to real estate. We've had surveyors, closing attorneys, title examiners, anybody connected with the real estate market. But it being July, I thought we might just get into some of our local history. And we have a great resource at the Registry of Deeds, the Plymouth County Registry of Deeds Notable Land Record Collection. And we did a tremendous amount of work together with Susan Aprill, who is the archivist at the Kingston Public Library. Susan is my guest today. Welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And it's great to see you again. As I started to say, and people that have watched this show before are aware, we value our historical records. We're not the National Archives, but we have a lot of great history in Plymouth County. And a lot of them are in our land records. And when you and I talked quite a while ago, we talked about bringing forward a lot of the historical sites in Kingston that were reflected in our land records. And I know we worked together on the display as you walk in the registry through the corridor on the left-hand side with a lot of Kingston memorabilia. But we also have worked together, and you have done tremendous work on 12 different properties, and all of which have a great story to tell. So, you know, this month celebrates Independence Day. We're past that here, but a lot of this relate to great history of the United States, and a lot of people in Kingston and other places that watch this show will find a lot of this fascinating.
I hope so.
So can you just share with our viewers a little bit about your background, how you get into this line of work, Susan?
I kind of fell into being an archivist when I was in library school. I took a class, Examples of Archives, and was just amazed to find out that this was something that you could do for a living, to work with old documents and photographs, books, prints, maps, artifacts. It's a wealth of history in the Kingston Public Library in particular. I went to school to be a librarian, and then I got a second master's degree in history with a certificate in archival management. I started out working at a multimedia interactive design firm, which I did for a little while.
And where was that?
In New York City.
Oh, great.
And then I worked at the Brooklyn collection of the Brooklyn Public Library for several years. When I moved to Massachusetts, I started looking around. I thought, there's history here. There are libraries everywhere. And I wound up in Kingston, which is a very small library, but has an incredibly rich collection.
Right.
The history of Kingston dates back to the history of Plymouth Colony. It was part of Plymouth Colony for a long time. And the people in Kingston are well aware of their historical place. They've contributed all kinds of materials to the library, and the town has the foresight to have an archivist on staff to take care of these materials and provide access to them. So I was very happy to work with you to bring some of our records out in a different way.
And anyone that's watching this show could go onto our website, PlymouthDeeds.org, and you can see all of the notable land records that we've put on so far. And the images will come up for all the ones we're seeing today, along with many others. And so let's get going into the project here. You mentioned New York. I think a lot of people would find it fascinating, and I certainly did, that the first English mayor of New York City actually lived in Plymouth Colony and Plymouth County now, and what is now the town of Kingston. Do you want to talk about Mr. Willett?
Well, Willett came over early. I'm not sure if he was the first comer on the Mayflower or right afterwards, but he was the captain of the guards after Miles Standish. He became a trading representative to different parts of the coast. So he was interacting with the Dutch early on, who were over in the Hudson Valley. And he served in many different capacities for Plymouth County. He was given a land grant in what later became Kingston. So he was not a Kingstonian because Kingston didn't exist until 100 years after Willett. But he built a house on his land grant, and part of that house is built into a larger structure that still stands. And it is probably one of the oldest wooden buildings in the entire country.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's amazing to realize that how small New York City was at the time.
At the time when the Dutch had it, it was a thriving outpost, but everything here was small then compared to cities in Europe.
Right.
And when the English took over from the Dutch, they chose Willett to become the first mayor of New York because he had good relationships with the Dutch, and that was when New Amsterdam became New York.
That's a great story. And as we talk, the images of those records are coming up for people to see.
Along with historical photographs from the local history room at the Kingston Public Library.
Great. So let's talk about the pumping station.
The pumping station is one of my favorite buildings in Kingston. It's a little brick building on the Jones River, right where Elm Street crosses, and it was built in 1884. Kingston had a water supply, an aqueduct company, as early as 1800. Again, one of the first in the country. But they had a limited reach throughout the community. There were basically wooden logs hollowed out to supply water to people's cisterns. You had to buy a subscription. So as the town grew, they needed clean water, and they also needed fire protection. So several residents got together, petitioned the government, and the town government responded and built a water system. And the pump house is still the headquarters of our water department.
Great. So the next one we're going to talk about is the dam site on Lake Street.
This is a really interesting case. When I first started working in Kingston, I realized that one of its true claims to fame was as a shipbuilding area. But when you look at the Jones River, it's hard to imagine that. The reason is that in 1904, Brockton applied to the state legislature for the right to take water out of Silver Lake and use it for the city. And one of the things they did was buy a small dam where the Jones River started at the outflow of Silver Lake. That dam had previously powered all kinds of different mills on that site back to the 1730s. But in 1904, Brockton bought it, and they basically drained the Jones River to a very low level compared to what it had been. So it's still a problematic issue, although Kingston did go to court and won $17,000 to settle the claim for all time, most of which had been spent on lawyers by that point. So it's a done deal now, but it changed the face of the river, which is a major part of Kingston.
Right, it's certainly a current issue today. Grays Beach Park.
Grays Beach, along with the town landing, were both purchased by the town in the 1930s and made into areas specifically for public access to the waterfront. So the town started really growing in the 30s when the streetcars came down from Brockton and you could take the train in from just about anywhere. It was important for people to have access to the waterfront, and Grays Beach in particular was reclaimed from a muddy, tangled flat of poison ivy, and it's one of Kingston's hidden jewels today.
And there was shipbuilding in that area?
Not at Grays Beach, at the town, farther down.
Okay.
At the town landing. The Delanos Wharf, that's a private home now, was actually for fitting out the ships. They didn't build them there, but they'd warp them down the river and then set up their sails and rigging at the wharves along Rocky Nook.
And there was a WPA project at the time that, in 1937.
Yeah.
That cleared away a lot of that.
Yeah, and brought in sand, landscaped it a little bit. I believe they built a bathhouse at that time. It's been added to since, but that was the start of it in a WPA project.
Right. And it's listed as one of Kingston's best loved public spaces and a hidden jewel in Rocky Nook.
People do love it.
The town landing.
The town landing is closer to the mouth of the river, and the town wharf is there. It's been recently rebuilt as the Jeffrey Bond Pier, named after a Kingston employee. It has been a place where people have put boats in the water, both for recreational and commercial uses, since at least the 1890s. The Kingston Yacht Club had their first building there when they first started in the 1890s.
And it's now owned by the town.
Mm-hmm. It is a piece of town property.
Right.
The harbor master's office is down there.
Hathaway Preserve, the first property acquired by the Kingston Open Space Committee. It has trails, rest areas, 4 bridges, and a 100-foot-long boardwalk for the public.
This is a really great example of Kingston preserving its historic and rural character, is the amount of open space that the town has. And the Hathaway Preserve was one of the first pieces that the Open Space Committee bought. It has some historic sites on it. There was a brick mill and kiln there owned by Stephen Bradford, and so there's still some archaeological ruins from that time in the preserve, but it's wonderful that Kingston has so much open space that captures its history as well.
And I understand there's a lot of hiking that goes on in that area.
Yeah. It's part, I believe it's part of the Bay Circuit Trail, which stretches quite a ways.
Great. And along the way, there'll be pictures interspersed with the conversation, and we can maybe summarize some of those at the end too. So let's talk about the Frederick Adams Public Library. A lot of people drive by it and notice it as a good-looking building and don't really know what it was all about.
Well, it was the town's first library, and it was donated through the will of Frederick C. Adams. The library opened in 1898, and it was a building that was built specifically for the library. It's now called the Adams Center, and the town holds events in it. And the Kingston Public Library, the library that I work in, is directly across the street from it.
Right.
But the Adams Library, that building is on the National Register of Historic Places. So it's quite an important building for our town. It's been beautifully renovated, and it's actually available for different events if people are interested in that.
Yeah, it's right on Route 3A as you go through Kingston. We actually had a group that went over and visited it when we were looking to add temperature, humidity-controlled vault in reading room at the Registry of Deeds, which we did recently for the colonial records. And I know in the basement of that building there, they've done a big space with temperature, humidity control in the renovation. And the renovation came out beautiful.
It's a
beautiful building.
It is.
That's great. And it's one of the Kingston properties on the National Register of Historical Places.
It is.
Yeah. The Font School, originally called the Center Primary School, and it was called in this display a functional antique restored to town service in 1976.
The Font School is a really beautiful, classic New England one-room schoolhouse. There were 6 of these built in Kingston in the 1840s after the federal government had a surplus and gave money back to the states in order to Unusual, I know.
Yes.
And it was earmarked for education. Kingston built 6 schoolhouses, and the Font School was one of them. It served as a schoolhouse for generations of Kingston children into the 1920s. At that point, other schools had been built, and it was eventually sold to the Kingston Grange, which sold it back to the town in the 50s. It was used as office space, and it deteriorated somewhat, and there was a fire in it at one point. But during the bicentennial year, 1976, part of the Kingston's anniversary committee, was Kingston's 250th anniversary that year.
Okay.
They got together and renovated it, and now it's used for meetings for the town.
Right. And here's one that I always find very interesting. And a lot of people will notice it because it's right on a major route, Route 27 there.
It's on Main Street in Kingston.
On Main Street.
Yeah.
And the surprise Hos House, Kingston's first firehouse, and it's still part of the fire department.
It is. It's a small museum for some fire department memorabilia. It's open in December during the annual Luminaries celebration. And it was the first hose house. And when the fire department was founded, at the same time, the pumping station opened. They laid a water system that included hydrants, and then they needed firemen to go out and fight the fires. And that's where they hung out. The name is taken supposedly from one of the fire captains saying it would be a surprise if anyone showed up at a fire.
And that's a myth.
That's what they say.
And it houses memorabilia.
Now the fire department has some memorabilia.
Yeah, and it's open how often?
I believe it's just open annually during the Luminaries.
Okay, great. Next one is C. Drew and Company.
C. Drew was one of Kingston's major manufacturing businesses. It was a family business started in the 1830s, and it was owned by Drews well into the 20th century, maybe into the 1970s. They made, in particular, shipbuilding tools, trunnel augers, cat's paws, marlin spikes, caulking mallets, all kinds. We have a great collection of shipbuilding tools, and many of them came from the C. Drew factory. When there was shipbuilding in Kingston in the 19th century and even in the century before, they had to make their own tools, and C. Drew specialized in this, and the tools were known all over the world for their quality. They were made in Kingston for 150 years.
Yeah, I think people tend to forget how important shipbuilding was as an industry in the days when they had ships, clipper ships, and other ships built that brought goods all around. It was so much easier to travel by water.
It was so much easier to travel by water, even between here and Boston. We think of it as being very close, but when the roads are bad and you only have a horse, it's a long way.
Right. And I did a great tour of the North River shipyards at one point, and I'm a kayaker. So they have some great plaques along the North River that talk about the different shipyards. Let's talk about Woodside.
So Woodside is an interesting house. It was in the Brewster family for many, many years, but originally built by someone from the Bradford family, two very common Pilgrim names. Woodside is privately owned now, and it's a house that's full of mysteries and histories in every corner of it. It's had, there's a cabinet of curiosities in there that have been recently donated to the library, and they're just little pieces of history that were shown as a house museum in the 1930s. But it is one of the oldest houses in Kingston.
And it's now privately owned.
It is.
Yeah. Yeah, Brewster name is certainly a well-connected name for anybody that's walked around Brewster Gardens and walked up what was Leyden Street with the lay of the land from Bradford in 1626. Kingston Townhouse, a seat of town government from 1841 to 2003.
And when Kingston was first founded in 1726, there was already a meeting house in place, which was the same as the church, on the site of today's First Parish Church. And the town people met there. It was their meeting house. The church and the government were not yet separate. But at the beginning of the 1800s, different denominations started splitting off, setting up their own churches, and eventually the town wanted to have a separate townhouse. So in 1841, they did build a separate townhouse for civic government, separating from the church. And that townhouse served Kingston well into the early into the 20th century. So we have a new townhouse now, which opened in 2003, and the old townhouse is also privately owned.
Yeah, I hope that eventually the Massachusetts curriculum for education requires local school children to learn their town history.
The third grades, I believe, do get some introduction to local history.
Right, right. And I know we can go on and on. There are other things we haven't even done yet, but I'm getting a signal that our time is up.
It's so short.
So the images that came up, the pictures that'll be coming up along with them, will give people a great idea of the town of Kingston's great history. I want to thank you for the time you've given us today.
Thank you so much.
And all the work you did getting this together.
It was fun.
So thank you, Susan.
Connor is struggling in school.
Finding lowest airfare to Istanbul.
Why don't you understand me?
I do. This is what it feels like for kids with learning and attention issues. Redirecting to understood.org.
I want to thank Susan Aprill for her last segment, talking about all the historical landmarks in the town of Kingston. It's a great learning experience for anyone. Certainly was for me as we went through that. And the work that they do in preserving records and getting a chance to tell the story is something that we all try to do together. I just want to highlight again that recently we built a temperature control, humidity controlled archive center at the Registry of Deeds with the colonial records. There'll be more about that in Nick's shows as to how people can access that. I want to thank Lorna Green Baker or Christine Richards from my office for helping me put this show together. PAC TV is allowing me to share this information with many local communities. David Antoine, Erica Christensen, Ben Alexander, and Tom Bowles, I want to thank for their help on this show. We think it's important that we share information about real estate and talk about the history of Plymouth County, and it's a great opportunity to do that. So with all of that said, I will see you next month.